Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. So there's data that shows that the built environment is responsible for somewhere around 13.6 billion tons of CO2 emissions into the environment every year. That's around 40%, a little less than that, of all carbon emissions per year. On the flip side of this, there's only about $155 million in philanthropic funding that goes towards the built environment. This means that only about 1/100th of 1% of philanthropy is going towards something that is responsible for almost 40% of all CO2 emissions. Historically, there has been little to no meaningful relationship between philanthropy and architecture. And the relationships that do exist largely exist on the cultural side. There are grants to fund books and exhibitions and lecture series and media. All of these things are great. All of these things are important to fund. But what would it look like for philanthropy to engage in the intersection of climate change and architecture? What would it look like for projects that could be fully realized in the world to be funded? Projects that could be community-led and local and address the root causes of the climate crisis. This, in many ways, is the mission of REARC, a young philanthropic organization that is working at the intersection of climate action and architecture to reimagine our social and ecological systems. Through grants, public discourse, and this fascinating new initiative called Practice Lab, REARC is trying to prototype new models for both philanthropy and architecture. My guest on the show today is Nicolay Boyadjiev, the director of REARC's Practice Lab. At REARC, Nicolay has helped develop new models of practice to enable built projects from architecture practices that respond to local needs that are rooted in their unique social and ecological context. They center and serve specific communities and build on the practice's existing work, hopefully providing a blueprint for future projects. There's a lot in here, and Nicolay and I get into the mission of REARC and how the Practice Lab specifically is structured to allow for new types of funding models and new types of architectural projects. Before helping to start REARC, Nicolay spent 5 years at the Strelka Institute in Moscow, a time that clearly influences how he thinks about the work he's doing now. And we talk about the relationship between the two organizations. As you'll see, I'm really fascinated by what Nicolay and the team are doing, and it was great to hear how they think about this work and where it could go next. If you like the show and what we do here, you can support us by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free to everybody, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and helps keep this show free for everybody. Our paying subscribers truly enable us to do this work and keep the show going. So if you want more of this work in the world, please consider signing up and supporting our work over on Substack. Thank you for listening, and here is my conversation with REARC's Nicolay Boyadjiev. What is the REARC Institute? How do you describe what it is that you all are doing?
Well, I think what's interesting about REARC is that it's really a collective of different people, of different voices. So I think we may all have a different
Right.
definition of it, which is always a challenge in itself. I think the way that I would describe it is that, simply put, it's an independent philanthropic association that's based in Denmark but works globally. That essentially supports, projects and initiatives at the intersection of architecture and the space of climate action. So we work with various different types of contributors to both expand what we mean by that intersection, what architecture means, much beyond design, much beyond general planning, also including land use, policy, collective stewardship, legal design. Expand that definition in order to basically try to make an impact and address the root causes and consequences of our ongoing climate crisis. That's as short as I can do it, I think.
You're about 2 years old. It seems like there was some development time before you sort of officially launched, but it seems you're officially about 2 years old. Is that right?
Yes, I think officially we launched in the summer of 2023.
Okay.
We've been working since 2022, a little bit undercover and stealth.
Tell me how this started. Where did the framing for this organization come from? Where did this idea about working at the intersection of climate action and architecture? Can you give me a little bit of the origin story for all of this?
Yes, I think I think it's actually quite an interesting and original, and maybe I would imagine atypical origin story of
Yeah.
sorts because it really came at the invitation of the Inter IKEA Foundation, which is a foundation that is, despite the name, neither IKEA nor the IKEA Foundation. It's the Inter IKEA Foundation, which is the foundation that owns the sort of the brand and the vision of IKEA.
Mm,
And they approached, I think, a collective of different sort of creatives, different professionals, none of which had a real background in philanthropy, to come up with a relevant, contemporary, an impactful model for an impactful institutional model for philanthropy at this intersection. So
mm.
it was really kind of a really interesting brief to think not just the outcomes that such an organization could support, but actually the processes and the framework of the organization itself, which is why I think it's probably not as most organizations start in this field.
What was your pitch? You get this brief. The Inter IKEA Foundation says we want to do something around architecture. We want to do something around climate. How do you think through that? How did you think about how to respond to that brief? What was your pitch back to them, I guess, is the question I'm asking.
Pitch would be not necessarily the word I would use. I think it was more of a dialogue. I think we were very I think fortunate that they had a very open vision about what an organization like this could look like. This is also why they approached a group of people that came from very different backgrounds. Some of us came from a sort of creative entrepreneurship background, had been involved with Space 10, which is
Mm,
IKEA's sort of former design and innovation lab. So they came from that background. Some others came from the world of media design, publishing, the context
mhm,
of Dean Journal, which
mhm.
you may know that deals with design in a
Yep.
much more expanded sort of social practice model. And me myself, I came from the sort of weird hybrid
We'll
sort of
talk about that.
reality. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But it's essentially a mix of sort of professional practice and experimental education in the context of Strelka. So when we assembled this group of people, they were aware that they weren't going to get something that was sort of
Right.
the typical framework. And the way that we approached it is essentially we started from this mission that I mentioned, but also thinking about let's say the pluralistic lens that such a mission would have to involve. And
Mhm.
pluralism here, I mean not just in a sense of like geographic or cultural, but also disciplinary. There's multiple disciplines, there's multiple types of actors that need to
Yeah.
be activated, and therefore we build an operating model around those different professional or disciplinary communities. So that was really the nature of the pitch, was starting from the people that we wanted to support, and how could we work and develop working models to directly resource and enable these different communities.
I mean, so Rearc is basically organized around three major sort of pillars or verticals. I would describe them from what I can tell. And so you have grant making, which sounds to me the most sort of traditional or the most sort of easily definable of those when you're thinking about philanthropy. And so that's donations to nonprofits and things like that. You have public discourse, which seems to be events, publications. You've produced a couple podcasts, which are great. Um, and then you have this thing called Practice Lab, which I want to talk about the most. But before we get into that, um, can you tell me a little bit about how each of these pillars overlap or intersect or speak to these different audiences that you were just talking about, the grant making, the public discourse, and then Practice Lab? And then we can get into kind of why Practice Lab is kind of so interesting here.
Sure, yeah, I think this is exactly the model. We have these three verticals. They're, I think, relatively independent and relatively parallel to each other, but also I would say they're quite complementary and they work. We work across these verticals, so these are not sort of set in stone. They're meant to be complementary and mutually reinforcing. So within the grant making vertical, we, as you mentioned, work with activists, grassroots organizers, more traditional NGOs, or at least organizations that are registered,
Mhm.
and I'll talk about that a lot after the problem of registration. And that lends itself to a particular kind of support. That is essentially we try to create a light bureaucratic setup so that essentially we can easily and quickly resource these organizations without the hassle of all sorts of different things that's happened in this process. Within the public discourse vertical, which is, I would say, quite different from simply thinking of it as communication.
Mm,
It's not our communication arm as it
right.
sometimes gets misread. It really is the space where we work with cultural producers, storytellers, educators, and build grants that support their work. That doesn't necessarily lead
Okay.
to buildings, but leads to essentially the creation of a worldview about architecture that we believe in, and that in turn I think also works well with the practice lab where we work with the different also practitioners, but practitioners, because we've essentially enabled, we created a model where we could support the grant making activities and we can support the public discourse, let's say cultural production activities. We could actually double down on working with, you know, professional architects and professional practitioners, essentially the non-nonprofits, the studios that are not registered as nonprofits and therefore don't really typically receive funding in the same way as these other two verticals do.
So just to be clear, so when you say non-nonprofits, you mean for-profit studios, basically, right?
Yes, I think maybe it's a joke to my former self having worked as an architect. Yes, I mean traditional studios that are registered as SEC or
Right.
registered as collectives actually frequently, but non-nonprofit meaning that they're not typically in a situation where they can receive direct
Right.
nonprofit or philanthropic grants.
Right. And so this is why I think what you're doing is so interesting, and specifically this practice lab vertical, which is where I want to spend a lot of the rest of this conversation, because I think as I was thinking about practice lab, as I was thinking about rearc, as I was thinking about philanthropy generally as it relates to architecture design, cultural production, so much of the funding for projects goes towards what I would describe as kind of cultural production projects, exhibitions, books, lecture series, publications, that sort of thing. All those things are great. I do that work. I get it. But it seems like what you're really interested in, it seems like what Practice Lab is really trying to do is figure out how do we actually fund projects that are, what's the word I'm looking for? Real, that actually have
Sure.
impact on the world, that are not just sharing of information, but are actually realized in some way. You know what I mean? So can you talk a little bit about why philanthropy has not historically funded those projects and how you're sort of thinking about kind of weaseling your way into that space to do something new?
Yeah, I like the word weaseling because it was a little
Yeah.
bit of a
Yeah.
reconnaissance project. No, I mean, as I said from the start, none of us, but myself in particular, I don't have a background in philanthropy, so this was an industry that was obviously aware of, and it was, I think, in equal parts, very curious about, but also fascinated slash sometimes wary, or at least
Yeah.
suspicious of. And I think, especially within the discipline of architecture, the reason for that is that I think obviously there's a lot of fantastic work being done in the field that you described, and also in the field of humanitarian architecture. But I think sometimes when we think about philanthropy and architecture as intersection, it either we either think of the humanitarian aspect, which is basically architecture as charity, architecture
Mm,
essentially, architects without
yeah.
borders, architecture for poor people, architecture for
Right.
in crisis mode, which is not a label that I think is accurate, nor that I want to perpetuate. And on the other hand, it perpetuates maybe another type of toxic trait in our profession, which is basically we are all misunderstood geniuses that are awaiting to be
Right.
discovered and rewarded by the powers that be, right? So
Right.
it's either architecture is something that is architecture in philanthropy is something that is sort of lesser than real architecture, because
Hmm.
it's architecture that's for the sort of 1% of
Right.
great thinkers. So basically, we really wanted to avoid getting reinforcing that false stereotype. So the project essentially began by creatively exploring this intersection of philanthropy and architecture as really as an opportunity space, as a space for design. And to your point, it became very clear that most of the grants in architecture were really in terms of past achievements. You've done
Right.
something, you receive an award. When there was in the context of future work, it was typically research work, which is again super valuable, but many conduits exist for that. And when it was built work, it was typically for temporary work. In
Right.
other words,
Right.
like
Right.
at each one of these cuts, it's lesser and less organizations that sort of. So we wanted to really to work on supporting future work, supporting future built work, and actually supporting future permanent work, which is
Mhm.
actually, as we discovered, quite challenging. And that's where the experiments start.
Yeah. So can you describe how Practice Lab functions, how you're actually going about thinking about this problem? Because it seems to go against everything that we sort of expect from philanthropy, but also everything that we sort of expect from how an architecture office works. So, can you talk a little bit about the process of actually kind of identifying architects, funding projects, and making sure that those are realized and permanent and helpful and all of the things that you were just talking about?
Yes. I mean, the kind of the shorthand description of the lab and really our mission, I would say, is that we work. It's basically REARC's experimental unit. So we
Mm,
call it the space of learning by doing, where we work directly with architects and professional practitioners to together prototype alternative models for philanthropy and architecture. That means a
mm,
couple of different things. It's always rooted in essentially the production of a built project at the end. So we support not only the proposal, but also the realization and also the design fees that come with that for the project. But our parallel project, let's say, is to prototype the conduit, the process that
uh,
would enable us to move nonprofit funding to a non-nonprofit in a way that's transparent, that's trust-based, that's countable, that's by the book. So this is where the experiment lies. The experiment lies less in the outcomes themselves, which are projects that are necessary, but that we're not trying to innovate for the sake of innovation, because
right.
many of the solutions actually exist. The experimentation happens in the pipeline of funding the project and the application of the contract, which is why I think the practice lab, and I like the word practice in that sense, because not only does it lean on both meanings of the word practice, both imperfect but
Yeah.
also action. So it's a space of experimentation that acknowledges architecture not as a product but as a practice, and therefore tries to build models of practice that would enable projects like this to come out.
I want to sort of outline something to you. Tell me if any of this is wrong, and I want to sort of, get your thoughts on this. So it sounds from what I can understand, you are funding sort of two phases or potentially two phases of a project. There's sort of a proposal phase. You're going to nonprofit architecture studios, for-profit architecture studios, and you're saying, hey, we'll give you X amount of money. What is a project in your community that is needed? We will give you this money to, pay you this amount to put together a proposal for this, this thing. And then with that, you go back to your donors and say, here's this project, you get more money, and then you fund the actual building construction materials of it. Is that sort of
Mhm.
basically how that's working?
It's that's partially true. I think,
Okay.
and this is also normal because I think that information is missing. But our process is actually across four phases.
Okay.
So in the first phase, we have the so-called research and curatorial phase, which is
Mm,
actually continuously ongoing, where we work with research-based practitioners that are rooted in different contexts, and that essentially we commission to do these collaborative briefs that amount to expanding our blind spots, but also let's say
right.
the bibliography of those briefs is the most interesting thing, because that's where the practitioners live. It's basically a
Right.
Rolodex of relevant practitioners in that context that we would have never been able to discover ourselves,
Yeah.
because they're not necessarily present in the media space. Once we run these briefs, we have these sort of portfolios of practitioners. During the proposal phase, we curate and invite typically between 8 and 10 of them per cycle, and we give them a very simple commission to, and simple in the sense that it's not very constraining, which is maybe what it makes it a little bit more difficult for them. But it's basically
Right.
to propose, essentially to partner with a local community, which is
Mm,
essentially the client in a way, to find their own clients in order to co-develop a brief together during the span of 3 to 5 months that they would present back to us, so that we can essentially approve with our advisory board and allocate funding to realize. So that's we work across these, let's say, three different phases: curation, proposal, realization, to get the project off the ground built.
Yeah.
And just to add, our fourth phase, which is also the bookend, is what we call our blueprinting phase, where in the same way that in the beginning we collaborated with a research practitioner, at the end we collaborate with local media designers, graphic
Mm,
designers, studios that partner with the architect, and together develop the documentation, the story, the narrative of the project, that not only becomes something that is shareable and sort of unpacks the impact of this project, but also becomes a little bit like the call for entries for the next practice to
right.
apply with Practice Lab to do a similar project in a similar context for a similar community.
This is making me think about a couple different things that I'm trying to articulate. And so hopefully I can formulate this into a question. But I'm wondering how you, in some ways, Rearc in the practice lab is acting as a kind of quasi client, in the fact that you are paying the studio to do something, but you are not the client in the sense that you are um, dictating the project. You have your demands. It seems like you don't have any of that. That is where the partnering with the community comes from. And so it's reevaluating the client designer structure in some way. So that's one thing I'm thinking about. The other piece of this that I'm thinking about is, how do you make sure that this is not read as a competition, that there are these calls for entries that, come in, and then you are deciding who wins and who gets the funding. And so it's sitting somewhere between competition and this sort of new quasi client setup. How do you kind of negotiate that and think through your relationship with these studios? You know what I mean?
So these are both great points and really ones that we sort of sit a lot with. So I'll try to address both of them. On your first point about the problematizing the
Yeah.
term clients, actually really, this is actually a core, I think a core purpose of the lab actually is to delaminate that term. Traditionally, I think as a society, as a professional society, as an the order of architects have really one of their design objects beyond buildings has been the typical, let's say, client contract of, like, there's a client that has a brief
Right.
and has resources, hires a service provider in a form of an architect that provides a building. Sometimes they check the boxes of having done community engagement, but
Right.
actually at the end of the day it's a linear process. So what we're trying to do is really we're trying to delaminate that line.
Mm,
Essentially, imagine you take this line and you sort of pull it apart, where the practice lab, you know, operates a little bit like a client because it has the resources to, hire the professional studio. But unlike a client, we don't dictate the brief.
right.
The studio, a little bit like a service provider, would provide the structure, but not to us, to a local community that they have, which becomes
Right.
essentially a co-developer of that brief. And that community that not only has coded up the brief and sort of been a key contributor in the design phase and the design process, ends up owning the project after that, ends up owning and maintaining the project. So that triangulation really, I think, spreads the role of the designer across multiple actors, and really, I think, breaks apart this kind of traditional way of thinking about the client as the beginning and end of a project. In a way,
Right.
we initiate the project, but we initiate it by selecting an architecture studio that we think is embedded in its context and would have no problems, collaborating with their community, because they are part of that community. In a way,
Right.
they happen to be a studio, but the distinction between them and the community is actually quite loose in most cases, and they essentially provide a service that we can support,
Right.
but the project is owned by that other client that is actually the one that matters. So that's
Yeah.
a little bit
That
how
makes
we think
sense.
about that. Your first point. If I can touch upon your second point about how to avoid making that a competition, which I think is maybe a little bit still perhaps in some cases controversial, but it's a decision that we took early on to not have a call for entries, not
Mm,
have, this is a by invitation process, to avoid essentially creating this idea that people have to do a lot of unpaid work to win the opportunity of working with the lab. What we want to do actually is we want to commission work and therefore value the work of the architecture studio, and therefore the process starts with us calling you on the phone, convincing you that we're not spam, and explaining
yeah.
that this is the setup, and effectively, commissioning and therefore paying for the first 3 to 5 months of design development that's required to find a community, do sessions with them, produce a concept, work into a context. This is all labor. So instead of perpetuating the kind of competition model where we assume this kind of
Right. I see.
infinite amount of labor that architects throw at
Yeah.
briefs, we wanted to reverse that, and therefore that's how we try to avoid that. I should also say that all the projects that we start, we are interested in realizing. In other words, we start with 8 to 10 studios in the proposal phase. We want to realize 8 to 10 projects. It's not like we start with 8 and we pick 4. Once we
Right.
start this process, we really try to get it through. So that's another way that we try to avoid this kind of competition mentality.
So can you talk a little bit more about that last point as much as you're able to? So much of this conversation so far has been structural and theoretical, but you're actually funding projects right now. Can you talk about like how many proposals are you working on with studios? How many projects are being built? How is this actually sort of manifesting itself in the real world right now, 2 years into this, experiment?
Mhm. Right. Well, since April 2023, we've engaged and we're currently working with I think 34 studios around the world. 34 studios. 10 of those are currently in the proposal phase, which we will sort of finish in March. But the 24 of these projects have been approved and therefore are currently at different phases of development. Some of them are nearly complete. I should say they're not 100% done as far as I'm concerned because we haven't wrapped the blueprinting phase. But effectively, most of these are in construction. Some of these are nearly done with construction and are sort of waiting to be unveiled and essentially documented and presented more publicly.
Can you give an example of one of those projects, or talk about the thinking and the building that's happening with those projects, just to give some sort of concrete examples of how this is manifesting itself?
Yes, of course. So, as I mentioned, our brief is extremely open.
Yeah.
It essentially, identify an opportunity in your local context that is not only difficult but actually sometimes impossible to realize within other funding, streams. And therefore, this is something that's needed. It's
Mm.
not something that's expensive necessarily, but it's just something that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen because there's just no traditional client to commission. So the projects that emerge from that brief are obviously very different because they're all highly contextual and site specific, but they all are part of this, I think, interesting typology of sort of hybrid architecture, infrastructure, landscape,
Okay.
social components, but also ecological functions. For example, we're doing a project now in San Lucas Xoloc, which is this community near Mexico, where I'm currently calling from. It is basically developing this basin that essentially collects rainwater in this small city, which floods because of inadequate infrastructure and also its proximity to the new airport in Mexico. So it's basically a basin that collects this runoff of water, creates a public pool, filters that water, creates a public pool, makes it available for irrigation, and builds a
Mm.
public space on top. So it's this kind of public. It's a public space. Most of our projects are public spaces. Neither of them are kind of acrobatic in a kind of architectural sense, but they all perform this kind of hybrid social ecological function.
Yeah.
So that's a concrete example. We're doing something similar in Morocco. Also has to do with water retention, infiltration. We're doing something similar in Thailand. So I should say that the project that emerge, and to make it less theoretical, are these, again, this interesting typology of infrastructure slash social and landscape and architecture and public space, which hopefully altogether amalgamates to, you know, defining that a little bit better. All these different
Right.
examples serve to define that typology through their existence.
You said something in there that I want to pick up on and talk a little bit more about and get your thoughts on. You talked about how many of these projects are projects that otherwise would be unrealized or hard to realize because there would be there traditionally wouldn't be a client for a project like this. And that's what strikes me as especially interesting about what you are doing is that these are projects that have the incentive to do these projects is a moral one, an ethical one, a desire to make change in some way. And often those types of projects don't have a client. They don't have a funding source. And so there's this tension between sort of market-based incentives. We're a for-profit design studio, a non-profit design studio. We need to make money, that therefore we need clients. But we also want to, we're also socially conscious. We also kind of want to work on work that is meaningful. And it seems to me that you're crossing that gap somehow. You're playing with this tension between where the incentive comes from to do a project. Does that sound right to you? How do you sort of think about that intersection of sort of the market and profit with the climate crisis and the sort of the ethical concerns with that, and how to bridge that divide?
Well, I think architects are, I mean, I'm speaking, well, again, for myself, I sort of graduated at the peak of the financial crisis, and therefore we were sort of stuck with this kind of mentality of, the world of architecture or the clients for architecture is either, a private, the market, the sort of the architecture that produces an ROI, and therefore we can work for that because there's an incentive there, or the state, which is sort of a different actor, or again, this kind of like third party, like reinventing ourselves as cultural producers and applying for work that sort of is funded through this kind of nonprofit sector that we talked about, which is basically grants for either past achievements or future non-built work. So these are, obviously not. This doesn't exhaust the possibilities of funding, of resourcing the creation of a built environment. There are many others, but in our case, we were interested in thinking about this other conduit, this third conduit, this the what could be the opportunity of thinking about a sector like the philanthropic sector that is very well resourced, almost as much as the construction industry is, although not quite. It might be a different order. There's a tremendous amount of funding, but that funding doesn't typically find its way into the built environment.
Right.
So so I think the project here is to unlock or potentially think creatively about that third conduit, and what would be its role and responsibility if we agree that thinking of philanthropy as charity is no longer accurate, or
Right.
thinking of philanthropy as awarding someone from the goodness of your heart is no longer the right framework. If we think about philanthropy beyond the creation of soft power, what are its other affordances that could support the built environment, and how can we, create those, incentivize those in ways that are perhaps missing? Because again, we come from as architects, we have a knowledge that sometimes the nonprofit sector lacks in the possibilities of the built environment.
I'm thinking back to that fourth phase that you mentioned too, where you sort of bring in designers and media people. I'm wondering if you see what you are doing as a template for others. You know, REARC and the Intra IKEA Foundation can't be the only ones who are sort of funding these projects. Is this something that could be open source multiplied to change those incentives in some way to make space for more of this type of built work to exist?
Uh, Absolutely. Actually, this is also why I tend to think sometimes of the practice lab as an alternative kind of design studio in a way.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah,
on the
yeah.
one hand, on the one hand, it's a funding program that supports the design studios to build the work, which is one type of output. But another output is the process, the template,
Right,
the
right.
contractual arrangements that we've managed to prototype. That in itself is a design output. In equal, I think of equal importance at a higher level,
Interesting.
which is what I think could be shared, it will be shared with the nonprofit sector more broadly. And this is also why we're so adamant about making sure that we can work on realized projects before we share it, because in a way you have to prove that it works by pointing at the projects that have
Right.
emerged. It's not enough to just talk about it.
Yeah. So how do you do that? Because that's exactly what my next question was going to be, is sort of how do you address the impact of these projects? How do you sort of you, I think one of the reasons that philanthropy does not fund built projects is just building takes a long time and it's hard to measure that impact. And sure, you have these buildings that are in various stages of construction and will live in the near future, but sometimes the impact of that will be years down the road. How do you sort of measure that or quantify that or think about that when you're then kind of communicating this outward?
Right. Indeed, as a side note, I should say that the word impact is one that it comes up a lot in philanthropy and almost never comes up in architecture, which to me was an interesting
Yeah.
professional demarcation. So I think it's a really important question because we think of the impact of our work really across three different scales that are maybe not only sort of different in space but also different spaced out in time. On the one hand, we have the sort of the direct impact that's created on site.
Mm,
Some of these
right.
projects, all of these projects, respond to a need, which is in itself impactful for the local community. But then there's, at a certain sense, an extended impact of this project and of this work that essentially, creates the opportunity for application, creates, knowledge that's being shared. The blueprints are all open sourced, and essentially it creates a community of practice among architects because our studios, we do gatherings. They all know each other in a way that we've sort of
Yeah.
created the community. But at a tertiary level, the systemic impact of this work, I think, is exactly as you put it, is to create a different model for architectural funding, really,
Hmm.
within an industry that recognizes both the reality of the climate crisis and also hopefully the not only the negative impact, but also the positive opportunity and the positive impact that architecture could make, which is the nonprofit sector. And in this industry, we could create templates for funding that would not only, catalyze these different typologies of projects that currently don't get realized but should, but also create a
Right.
different paradigm of practice, as we mentioned earlier, where there's like a architecture without clients in a
Yeah.
conventional sense of this kind of self-initiated, site-specific, community-led work that becomes an avenue for architecture studios to pursue while being non-profits, while operating a studio.
And so I've heard you use the phrase before. I don't think you used it in this conversation yet, but I've heard you use the phrase when talking about this work as para-philanthropic, as in, and I think that's what you're talking about there, where it's not against philanthropy, it's not anti-philanthropy, it's something that's like living next to it or in relation to it in some way. Is that how you describe that term?
Right. Yes, yes. I mean, this term has been mostly used opportunistically, and it's not at all a
Right.
manifesto or a scientific term. But I tend to use it because my former background working at the Strelka Institute, we were really a para-academic institution. We were operating in parallel to academia, not against academia. It was a highly academic program, but there was no fees, there was no exams, there was no professors. It was operating in parallel. And in a similar way, I think what I mentioned, para-philanthropy or para-philanthropic, I simply mean that the goal is not to it's not to be anti-philanthropy or better philanthropy or fixing philanthropy. It's moving away from this kind of solutionist dialectic
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
everything was broken until we arrived as innovators. It's not that. It's
Right.
much more about learning from philanthropy, operating, complementary to existing philanthropy, but also finding ways of support that go beyond traditional philanthropy. So that's what I mean by para as in parallel.
I love that you brought up Strelka in that answer because that's exactly what I was actually thinking about when I asked that question because Strelka also seemed like a sort of para institution, something that sort of lived between these others. So you were at Strelka for about 5 years, I think, starting as a researcher, and then you were eventually co-director with Benjamin Bratton up until uh, the institute shut down with the Russian invasion of Ukraine a few years ago. I'm wondering if you can talk about how what you're doing at Rearc relates to, diverges from, builds upon all the thinking that was happening at Strelka. To me, they seem actually very related. They're two very different types of institutions, but I can't help in this conversation the way you're sort of talking about living between these different spaces, sort of thinking about this transdisciplinary set of challenges. How did all of that work influence how you're thinking about what you're doing at Rearc?
I think it's a difficult question as it's in more ways than one. I think it's still a fresh. But obviously, I think what was interesting about Strelka was that it was it as a para academic institution, it was always concerned with the design of the institution itself. Like
Mm,
the
hmm. Yeah.
ongoing design project was the institute, and I think that's also how I think about the practice lab, and also how I think we think how our leadership group thinks about Rearc. It's in constant state of transformation. In the context of Strelka, it was most importantly multidisciplinary by default. Like essentially, it wasn't special that it was
Right.
multidisciplinary. There's especially in design, as you probably relate. There's sometimes a tendency of like hyper multi hyphenation. Like everyone's a designer slash curator slash DJ
Right.
slash something.
Right.
And at Strelka, we were all simply, whether you came from the, architecture, or you came from law, or you came from, journalism or economics, we were all essentially researchers. And
Mm,
therefore that flattening, I think, was really, you know, useful in approaching things from a curiosity first
yeah.
mindset, as opposed to from like an identity, like as it is, as this I do that. We didn't have that at Strelka, and I think that has actually, I think, survived a little bit at Rearc, because we tend to do the other way around, starting from
Right.
the opportunities and then building a framework
Yeah.
around it. Another, I think, direct link to this was this, this kind of the opportunity of being in Moscow. Myself, I'm not Russian. I'm of Bulgarian origin, but living in Moscow provided this really, this really interesting opportunity of being far enough from the hype, so to say, or having
Yeah.
our own, being away from the gravitational pull of sort of design culture groupthink that sometimes kind of exists within the, more popular design centers of the world. And that really allows us to kind of develop a way of thinking and a way of working that's moved away from the declarative, the declaration
Mm,
of good intentions, as obviously it was quite difficult to be declarative in the context of Moscow, but
right.
really, but really to do the work a little bit, without declaring it, dispositional, as Keller Easterling, who was one of our faculty, would call. And so that kind of paradox of the Russian context, of sometimes things being, easier to do than to say. Some things
Yeah.
are easier done than said in
Right.
Moscow.
Right.
That allowed us to kind of think about design as a sort of a strategic medium, that is less about essentially declaring your good intentions and focusing on, raising awareness about XYZ,
Mm,
and actually kind of working behind the scenes, within the realm of operations, within the realm of infrastructure, within the
yeah.
realm of contracts. And I think that has actually, really, sort of influenced, I think, how we think about the practice lab, with our collaborators.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. I actually see that connection a lot clearer now after you said that, because in many ways Rearc is completely focused on the doing, on the funding, on the actualizing. It cannot stay in the thinking, the ideas, the talking. I have two sort of related questions that are a little bit more personal for you. You mentioned earlier you studied architecture. You're trained as an architect. Your early career was working as an architect. First question is how did you get into all of this sort of strange work that you've done? How have you sort of where did that transition happen into institution building, into teaching, thinking, this philanthropic work, this sort of, the design not of buildings but of contracts? And then, so one, I'm just sort of curious about that move and what prompted that. The second question is what are the crossovers? What from architecture still sort of influences how you work today and the work that you're doing today?
Mhm. Oh, wow. Thanks for these. On going back memory lane a little bit.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, yes, I would consider myself. I mean, the first 6, 7 years of my career, it was fairly sort of normative architectural practice in a range of really interesting studios, both corporate, actually mostly corporate, some of them a little bit more boutique. But I think I was very fortunate of having, like I said, graduated, first of all, at a time where the financial
Right.
crisis really had, you know, made you aware that you were not only designing, you were designing your practice. Like
Yeah.
it became clear the design project was the design of your own studio in a way. So I was always kind of interested in the design of the frameworks that allow good work to emerge. As
Yeah.
and that was coupled, I think, with the first project that I was involved as, first as a design intern and then eventually as a kind of architectural designer, which was this competition for, at that time, the largest. I still, it's probably still the largest hospital in North, in at least in Canada,
Okay.
in downtown Montreal, which was incredibly complicated, sophisticated, assemblage of different disciplines, of different priorities, of different tensions. And as a designer, mainly working on the public spaces, on a kind of public interface of the building with the city. Again, it became very, very clear that the real forces of design were
Right.
not the kind of petulant, petulant whims of the auteur. Like
Right, right.
the real forces of design are infrastructural, operational. They live in between, and they
Yeah,
are usually not essentially celebrated. So with that particular mindset, it became very, very clear to me that in order for the interesting buildings to emerge, they require design relationships to be designed that allow them to occur, which
yeah,
means these relationships have to be, formalized in a form of contracts, and
right.
therefore institutions have to design the contracts that enable the relationships that enable the building. So, like this kind
Yeah,
of designing upstream, this kind of idea that design doesn't start at the building but starts several steps before,
right.
was clear intuitively as an architect on such a sort of mega structure. And then when I joined Strelka, as you mentioned, first as a researcher, that eventually the tremendous privilege of designing the education program that I wish I had attended.
Yeah,
We tried to, nurture that type of creativity, the creativity of
mm,
like moving design upstream, the
yeah,
creativity that is involved in institutional design, in interface design. Think about architecture not as a thing, but as a relationship across
yeah,
things. So those particular instincts that emerged in the first part of my career became a little bit more formalized at Strelka, and maybe more, let's say, more theory was built around them with the fantastic sort of faculty that we used to have at Strelka. So I think that was your first question.
yeah.
Apologies if I forgot or missed the second part.
That was great. I mean, my second question is, and you started answering this, is, how much of that early work, that time working as an architect, and also just studying architecture, how does that, or how do you think about how that influences the work you do now? Maybe a better way to ask the question is philanthropy a design project? Is practice lab a design project? How is design and architecture a lens or a metaphor or a way of approaching the work that you're doing today?
Well, without sort of hyperinflating the word design, because at some point everything is designed. I do think that I do think that organizational design, institutional design, is probably the biggest design both challenge but also opportunity of our time, or at least of our generation of architects. Because again, we keep talking about the climate crisis as if it was a problem to be a puzzle to be solved, which is actually that's not accurate. We don't have all the puzzles to solve it. First of all, solving it is the wrong framework, but definitely the idea that all the pieces exist is simply inaccurate.
Right.
So designing the missing pieces, designing the institutions that are able to have a positive contribution and impact on this sort of problem is crucial. So in that sense, the way that I see it, we're designing structures, institutional structures that lead to contractual arrangements that lead to built structures. We are designing structures to really address, I think some of the core challenges and the core problems of the discipline today, which is essentially this kind of double tragedy of the commons, where on the one
Mm,
hand, some things can't be left to the market. But on the
right.
other hand, some commons aren't allowed to exist simply because there's no one to initiate them. So that's what I mean by this kind of second side of
Yeah.
the tragedy of the commons. But also addressing this kind of paradox of the architect having to, on the one hand, the catch 22 of the profession. You have to
Yeah.
build in order to be hired to build. Like
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
practice lab, we're trying to change or to address that, but also to address the idea that as a practitioner, if you're not chasing traditional clients, and therefore you're not trying to design your identity and your brand, if you're not trying to
Right.
do that, if you're not trying to enter this kind of culture of newness and uniqueness and competition, if you're actually working with the sort of traditions of building that are sometimes not celebrated but are existent, because we don't reward you for being innovative. Like the goal of the practice lab is not to create a project that
Right.
never was. It's to create a project that simply hasn't been produced for different reasons. So in that way, I hope that we are building mechanisms to enable things to happen that leverage the expertise of the practitioner,
Right.
respond to a local needs, but also showcase that there's a different typology of architecture that could emerge from a very different kind of institutional actor.
Right, which goes back to your early experience working on this hospital, realizing that the power structures and the contracts were all happening before any design decision was made. Now you are working on You're now thinking about those contracts and those power structures and those incentives that you were sort of aware of, when you're whatever, 25, 26, 27.
Yes, and those structures are never neutral. They're always
Right.
they are always, like you said, they're subjective. They're designed. I think what's interesting about this kind of protocol design is that first of all, they're open for negotiation. The
Right.
contracts are never, even our templates are never the same as we use them. And I should also mention, we're working with a incredible law firm,
Mm.
Krohmann Reumert, in Copenhagen, that helps us design these contracts from the perspective of the architect, which is actually quite rare.
Yeah.
We're very fortunate for this. But you're right. We are able to push design much earlier than design the project, and in a way, this is why, again, maybe the para and para philanthropy, this parallel dual project of not only designing projects but designing this process,
Hmm.
really showcase how they kind of come together. In a way, we need the projects to emerge in order to validate the process, but the process is what enables these projects to begin to happen in the first place.
So what's next? Where does this all go? How, you've been doing this for 2 years. How do you scale this up? How do you diversify this? Like where's your head now with this process, and where would you like to kind of see it go next, or where is it going next?
I mean, the reason why we operate a little bit in I don't know if stealth is the right word, but less a little bit more modest in our
Yeah.
communication from the
I mean, you have a
perspective of the practice
beautiful
lab.
you have a beautiful website and an active Instagram. It's not completely stealth.
Of course, but I don't think that's it's. I don't think many of our build projects are
Oh,
showcased
right.
in
Yeah,
this way,
yeah, yeah.
and the reason is that they actually simply don't yet exist, which is also why we've been a little bit more quiet. So I think in the next year we're gonna have perhaps the first, definitely by next by 2020, by January 2026, we'll have the first dozen of our projects completed. So
Mm,
I think the objective now is to present them really as, obviously, we try very hard not to speak on behalf of the architecture studio and of the community. So this is why the blueprinting process actually is almost like an additional grant to
yeah.
help them communicate the project in their own words. But what we want to do is we want to basically showcase how all these projects are different, very, very different by definition, but together amalgamate to this different kind of typology that we have tried to catalyze. So we want to maybe be a little bit better at describing this typology and
Mm,
also describing the process, like open sourcing the contract that we're working to show this typology has emerged from this process, which was created by this
right.
organization. So this kind of 1, 2, 3 to visualize this kind of back end, this upstream design process by showing this collection of projects that together, reinforce this idea of kind of planetary response, which is by definition not one size fits all.
Yeah.
They together represent this collection of projects that are more than the sum of their parts, and by their existence, they show to the nonprofit sector and to the construction industry, perhaps, that this is possible because we've done it, and
Right.
here's how we've done it.
Right.
And again, our funding at REARC is generous, but it's also nowhere near the funding that is available to the nonprofit sector. So if we could actually scale and have perhaps creates various kinds of partnerships or coalitions
Hmm.
with other nonprofit organizations that are willing to also match our funding, to not produce bigger projects but to multiply, to kind of
Yeah.
scale by multiplication the presentation of the typology. I think this is an ambitious goal for the next 12 months.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation. I think the work that you're doing is so fascinating and important, and I am such a fan of the way that you're thinking about this. So thank you so much for being on the show and kind of talking through this whole process with me, Nicolay. This was great.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
That was my conversation with Nicolay Boyadjiev of the REARC Institute. It was recorded on January 10th, 2025. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is free thanks to the generosity of supporters like you. If you like what we do, I hope you consider supporting us on Substack. Get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.